Thank you, Sinan, for joining us. And Prakash, if I can just ask you to keep an eye out for people in the waiting room if they need admitting. I'm not sure if that's free entry at the moment or if you need to admit them, but yes, it's just turned 4. And Sinan, you're very welcome. And all of our members, you're very welcome to Behavioural Science Club. And this week, we're going to be talking about our book of the month, the very brilliant The Hype Machine. In early January, I'm already saying this is potentially my book of the year. I'm extremely excited about it. We're very honoured to have Sinan with us today. And Sinan is director, MIT professor, world leading expert on social media. And as is such a new book, so I'm very aware that possibly a large number of you won't have read it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open by just reading a few bits from a very brilliant, very current preface of the book, which was written at the start of 2020, start of the COVID outbreak. It's an extremely current book. And this is just to give you all a taste of what we're going to be talking with Sinan about today. So reading now from the preface. People who make the social media industry tick are dedicated technologists. They're wicked smart and they're committed to making the world a better place. But social media's impact on the world is not determined by intention alone. Studies show lies spread faster than the truth. We relied on social media for human connection, social support, and life-saving information, but it was also a cauldron of misinformation. Surveillance capitalism morphed into life-saving disease surveillance. So which of these visions of social media is correct? The promise or the peril? Is the hype machine a force for good, for collective intelligence and solidarity, or is it a scourge and a pariah? The pandemic reminded us just how much we've come to rely on it for everything. The hype machine has the potential for both promise and peril. We're at a crossroads. To act responsibly, we have to educate ourselves about how social media works. It's a harrowing journey from unbelievable discoveries and sordid scandals about how social media impacts our democracy. But most of all, it's a story that involves every one of us now and for generations to come. Sinan, what would you say is the main message that you're trying to get across to people from this book? It's such a wealth of information.
Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure. And I just want to apologize for the mask, although also not apologize. I find myself in a public place, unplanned, in that I had to bring my car here for service, and I'm kind of stuck in between home and being on the road. And so I'm wearing the mask because I'm in a public place. I assure you I'm smiling underneath. So there's not a lot of emotional conveyance already in our Zoom world, but the mask doesn't help. So my apologies for that. So I think my main message here is quite simple, which is to say that we're all now aware of the tremendous dangers that social media engenders, from its effect on our democracies to its effect on our economies and to its effect on our public health, coronavirus misinformation, and so on. We've got a large push now for vaccinations around the world, and misinformation could really derail people's individual decisions to get a vaccine. We see in the United States right now and elsewhere in the world, as I've described in my book, dramatic effects on our democracies. And I outline how it could impact our economies. But I also try to, in the book, describe some of the promise of social media, some of the amazing things that we're able to accomplish as a human collective with a communications technology like this. And I describe several of those things, including the fact that when Nepal had its greatest earthquake in the last 100 years, Facebook spun up a Donate Now button and raised more money for disaster relief than the United States and Europe combined to deliver to Nepal. the Ice Bucket Challenge raised $250 million for ALS research in 8 weeks. These types of social organizing are not possible without social media. In fact, the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States have said that there would be no Black Lives Matter movement without social media. Research at MIT and at Stanford shows that social media creates about, Facebook alone creates about $370 billion in consumer surplus every year in the US alone. Imagine that globally, because Facebook is US is a very small corner of Facebook's total global user base. And in some parts of the world, Facebook is the internet. In the Philippines and parts of Africa, it's where you go to start your small business. It's where you go to reskill. It's where you go for meaningful human connection. Many people get a lot of their news from social media and so on. So the message of the book is simple. There's a tremendous amount of promise and a tremendous amount of peril. And what we do in the next 18 to 24 months is in large part going to affect whether we achieve the promise or whether we get the peril. And in order to really be effective, we have to stop armchair theorizing about social media, and we have to get nuanced about how it works under the hood with science. We have to get past the debate about, is social media good or evil? The answer is yes. And if we're going to make any meaningful strides towards the promise and away from the peril, these sort of platitudes need to really translate into much more nuanced conversations about policy, about technology design, about the norms of use, and about the economic business models that these companies have adopted.
Thanks, Sinan. I love that you've led it in that direction, because I wanted to bring that up. I think it's what you call the hype machine finger pointing blame game. And you say that there is no silver bullet, but there are solutions. And just for the members here, I'll just summarize something that Sinan puts in the book, which is that social media, they say it's a lack of regulation. Governments who need to regulate say, oh, they've turned a blind eye to the weaponization of their technology. The public inaction. But we need to be more responsible, as Sinan says. We need to be more responsible for social media. And the truth is, as he says, we've all been asleep at the switch. And in the end, each of us must take responsibility for the part we're playing. And I'm sure absolutely everybody here agrees with that and the sentiment. But I think also there's this just uncertainty of how can we be active as individuals against something that seems so enormous.
Yes, such an important point. And, I think all three of these stakeholders, the platforms, the policymakers, and the people, all have a role to play in how we steer this ship. No one is steering this ship by themselves. We're all collectively steering it. And so the policymakers clearly have things they need to do about competition policy, about the line between free speech and hate speech, about election integrity, about the spread of misinformation, about the privacy of our data. These are all regulatory challenges. These are market failures that deserve legislative scrutiny around the world. The platforms obviously have a responsibility in how they're designing the platforms and the algorithms that underlie the platforms, which I describe in great detail in the book. But also, we as citizens have a responsibility with how we use social media. And what I mean by that is we have a responsibility to, for instance, act responsibly with regard to misinformation, okay? We can do better at, before sharing misinformation, vetting it. A lot of the misinformation can be debunked with a simple Google search, but we just don't do it. We're reactive in a sense. We have a responsibility to educate our kids. I have a 7-year-old son, and media literacy is an important piece of that. The way that we use inflammatory language on social media. We have to temper it. And the norms that we as a society adopt are going to be essential. So things like the Delete Facebook movement, the Stop Hate for Profit movement, and all of these are examples of citizenry essentially trying to set norms about what we think is acceptable and what we think is not acceptable. So we should join in that conversation in order to be a part of it. So the summary is the policymakers have to do their part, the platforms have to do their part, and the people also have to do their part, the users.
Thank you, Sinan. I'm going to leave the political conversations to QAnon to Prakash, because I'm sure he's absolutely busting to get onto that subject with you. So just before I move off and let Prakash have a chat with you, I wanted to just ask a private question, a personal question rather, and this is from something I've been reading about. I was fascinated on the section which you call the hype machine's visual cortex. And again, I'm just going to read something for all of the members. Video accounts for 80% of all consumer internet traffic. And while viewers retain 10% of the messages they read, they retain 95% of messages they watch in video. In other words, video, not text, is the hype machine's primary medium now. You go on and explain a lot about technology that can actually read movements, read the movements in video, the body language can read, basically read video. But an interesting thing I was reading about recently, which I'd like to hear your opinion on, is that it's harder to tackle misinformation on Instagram than Facebook, since it's harder to train an algorithm to recognize misleading text in slideshow images, different format that's used. And this has now been adopted by political movements who have realized that the soft focus of these slideshow movements.
Uh-oh. I think we lost her.
I think she dropped.
If you want, yeah, I could quickly answer her question, Prakash, if that sounds. I think I got the question basically.
Go ahead, Sinan.
Yeah, and then maybe she'll come back, or we can continue, or you can continue. So basically, we have to think about the technology as a progression over time. We can't really think about the technology as it was or the technology as it is today. If we're going to be effective, we have to understand its trajectory and figure out where it's going and address that as well. And it's going not just to video, which I describe in detail, and the book really does try to give everyone a sense for, in layman's terms, how this stuff really works under the hood, to describe the technology and the algorithm so that people get a sense for how this stuff actually works. And so I describe the visual cortex, which is the technology that the platforms use to analyze video. Everything from facial recognition, emotion recognition, body language. They can tell whether you're playing tennis just by looking at how your movements, how your body is moving. They can tell if you're riding a horse and distinguish that from if you're riding a motorcycle, and so on. And so understanding that is essential. It is harder to decipher misinformation in non-textual form, but there is technology that is that visual cortex that does a great part of that. But if you go beyond video, when you're thinking about misinformation, really the next horizon is audio and video deepfakes, which are generative adversarial networks designed to make audio and video that is convincing to the human eye and ear. And that I cover in chapter 2, which is called The End of Reality, which we're kind of witnessing in real time. I was just listening to a podcast, and Prakash, I know you probably want to get into this, but I was just listening to a podcast about the Capitol riot and how the basic narratives that are believed by people who believe they need to storm the Capitol in order to create a revolution because the democratic deep state are a bunch of Satan worshiping, child molesting, child eating, people, and so it's a bit scary to really think about what it means to experience an end of reality almost.
Thank you so much, Sinan, for touching that, and we will come to it shortly. Our group, and I can see Louis is just about joining back. Our group is around 25-2600 people on LinkedIn. So it's ironic that we are sitting down and discussing social networks and their bad side. Whereas in reality, for us as a group, this particular group, which is all on social network, has been fantastic. Last year, we sit down every Saturday. We speak with fantastic folks like yourself, who graciously offer us their time and their expertise. And so that being the reality out there, the thing also about our group is we got people who are newbies, just about starting into the field. And then there are folks here with PhDs and people who are founder members of GAB and stuff like that out here. So it's a pretty diverse group of folks out here. And so we'll be having their questions coming up in a couple of minutes. Louise, I can see you are back. I hope it was not me who kind of clicked something wrong and you got thrown off. I'm not sure that happened. So I noticed you have this chapter, The End of Reality, you just mentioned about it. And my question was around that. Essentially, there's also a comment from someone saying, I think from Harmony, who's telling about her cousin who actually watched the social dilemma and was very impressed with the documentary and used this knowledge of the social dilemma to double down on the claim that Democrats, they are the bad lot, evil lot, XYZ. There's a deep state conspiracy. And the social dilemma is proof, right? So you would, in a world, exist this to kind of open up eyes of people whom we call right-wingers in general. So from there, we go to the question now. Question being this, in my grandfather's time, right, when he was living in this village and there were 40 families, if there was one guy who was kind of crazy and cuckoo, right, he was the one crazy guy in that village. The rest 39 families were sane folks. And so everybody knew that this is the one opinion which is not in majority. So the reality this person experiences is different. So it is not real. What we say as 39 folks is real, right? That becomes where to define it. And there were villages like that. So my grandfather, your grandfather, and each village had one crazy guy possibly, or a person who had this theory, right? But they were not connected with each other. So my grandfather's crazy guy in that village didn't know the crazy guy in your grandfather's village. And what internet has done is it has connected all these isolated villages. So each of those guys who are kind of crazy, whom we call crazy, okay, now, they all have found folks who are similar to them, right? And now because I know 39 more guys who have the same view as me, who don't live near me, but they are those, right? The question then becomes, am I crazy for believing what I'm believing in? So am I really crazy when I say maybe the earth is really flat? Who knows? Yeah. Maybe vaccines are really bad. Who knows? Maybe they're trying to put a microchip, right? So from there comes this question of, in this world, how do you know what is real? It's kind of a stupid question to ask, but you are the person who's done a fantastic research. So I think we'll start with that. All yours.
So this isn't a stupid question. I think it's one of the most essential questions that we face as a global society today. And I mentioned this in my TED talk, and I say, okay, like let's go down the path of how do we solve misinformation. Okay, well, you need fact checking, and you need to establish reality. You need some process for establishing what's real, and there are a consortium of international fact checkers. But the question, if you seriously consider that question long enough, you realize that eventually you have to ask yourself, okay, well, who's checking the fact checkers? And who's checking those people? And at the very bottom of that chain, the question is, who gets to decide what's real and what's fake? Who gets to decide what the truth is? Because a lot of it is political, you know? And so I'll give you, you know, so I don't have a great answer to that, except to, as I say in the TED Talk, that technology is not a solution for that. Philosophy and ethics are a solution for that. We need ethicists and philosophers to be part of this conversation, because we're really trying to understand, how do we as a society verify, validate, and prioritize the truth, and how do we define the truth, and how do we, in an equitable, just way, set up a process by which we can make sure that that happens continuously in our society. I think that's important. You know, like, for instance, you know, just to touch on what you said, I think you're absolutely right. As I've been saying to journalists this week about the Capitol riot, social media is a big driver of this, because it motivates people. It coordinates them, as we saw with the foiled plot to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan, which was coordinated over Facebook in the United States. It legitimizes a protest or a riot like this, because it provides social proof. Just like you said, Prakash, it connects you with other people who have similar views and are as riled up as you, and you start to rile each other up. And then underlying all of this is a steady stream of misinformation about what happened in the election that causes anger and fear, which motivates people to go riot. And I was speaking to an acquaintance of mine who is a conservative in the US, and she, you know, was fully believing that, you know, that the election was stolen. You know, and I said to her, you know, I said, there were 60 court cases, all of which were thrown out, most of which were thrown out by Trump appointed judges. So where is one shred of evidence to justify this? And the only place that she can point to is what she heard over social media. Anecdotal stories that are spinning around a certain sections of social media, which actually are quite broad and seep into more rational conservative opinion. I saw a news report of a woman who was telling her story about how she was drawn into QAnon over the last several months. She was a normal person, and then she had no idea about QAnon until a few months ago, and she was completely drawn into it because she said, you know, look, it was cultish. I was locked in my home because of COVID. I was seeking community. I needed to sort of like be attached to other people. And this gave me a community and a cause, and I was just sucked in, you know, and so I think all of this is part of the story.
Thanks, Sinan. And I think I'll have one question more, because there are a lot of questions
Yeah.
already out here. And in fact, some of them have actually prepared questions like 3-4 days in advance, because they knew you would be here. So, hey, I look forward to those questions, especially the ones from Lachijar. One last question, I think, would be around this research that we had done in 2017. We didn't complete it, but I'm kind of inspired after speaking with you to see maybe we should take it up. And it was around understanding why people forward on WhatsApp. You know, you forward on WhatsApp, and this was just around the time WhatsApp was trying to limit forwards to 5 forwards. And many a time when a forward we receive in a common group, right, it kind of seems obvious that this may not be true. And then the normal course of action then is a flame war or a war of words on, you know, WhatsApp among the friends. So what we were doing was we're trying to ask people to put up a small form, right? Every time they would forward a news. So 4 options. I believe this is true. I think this might be true. I think this might be false. This is false. And the last option, option number 5 was, this is just hilarious, right? So I'm sending it for the entertainment value. And the number of people who'd share it for the entertainment value of it was significant. And the number of people who were not sure that it is true was also significant. The experiment, we could not continue beyond a point because people are saying this is too much, no fun, and they kind of didn't want to do it. But the idea that we got at that point of time was, it is not malice, it's not being evil. The way we find it, right? Saying, oh, the other party is evil, the other party is stupid. You want to use those adjectives as opposed to understanding. It just seemed that this was happening simply because it was there.
Yeah.
Message will be forwarded. Yes. So what is the solution out here? And I know I read your part about how you had suggested even in a TED Talks about how you label news.
Yeah.
Right? What is the solution around? They would like to please us. That's in.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're very much right on the money in terms of why people share. And we found this also in our we conducted with Twitter. That was on the cover of Science, and it basically was 10 years of Twitter history. We had access to the historical archive, and we looked at all of the verified true and false news stories that were spreading over those 10 years. And what we found was that false news spread farther, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information, sometimes by an order of magnitude. And when we looked into why, the shock and novelty factor was a leading explanation. In other words, people are shocked, angered, they find it salacious, disgusting, and they forward it because it's just so shocking. It draws our attention because it's shocking. And we tend to, if you read the sociology literature, you know that we tend to gain in status when we share surprising information because it looks like we know something that other people don't know, like we're in the know, or that we have access to inside information. And so we gain in status if we're sharing novel information. So when something is surprising to us, we share it because we think other people not only might find it useful or novel to them, they might not have heard it, but also we think we're going to be the ones to sort of inform our friend group that that this or that is happening. And so I think that's all part of the story of why it spreads. Now in the book I go into detail about how we can really deal with it. And just to summarize, I think we need to have a multi-pronged approach. Certainly I describe labeling as being really important. We need to combine, automated false news detection systems with human in the loop moderators that are also checking. We need to, what we find in research is that when you can put people in a reflective mode, they're less likely to believe or share false news. So asking them every so often, is this article true, actually tends to go with them, puts them in a different way of thinking, and then they're more skeptical of the next article and the next article. So if you ask people, is this true, like you did in your study, not only can you at scale collect labels from the crowd about what might be true or false to guide your algorithms better, but you're also nudging people into a reflective mode that makes them less susceptible to believing or sharing false news. So I think that's a big part of it. I think obviously the platforms have a responsibility for taking it down. I think that we need digital media literacy. We need it taught in our schools. We need much more sort of pervasive media literacy programs going forward. And I think that, just ordinary citizens have a responsibility to be more critical, to think more critically. And all of that is sort of what I described at the top of the hour and what I describe in the book.
Thank you so much, Sinan. It is it's kind of interesting to see that not everybody is motivated by what you call evil. It's easy to label people like that. It is just the system is out there in place. And before you know it, the hype machine kind of leads you to believe that your president actually wants you to go out to the Capitol Hill and then, take over the things. I mean, it was
That's
very.
right.
It's been surprising to read the accounts of many of the people who are being charged, saying they were doing what the president asked them to do because they actually believed in him. Literally, I'm actually answering the call of my president. But
Right.
that will take us into a long discussion around
Right.
the debates here. And I think we have a lot of people ready with their questions. I would invite
Yeah.
Lachita for the next question, and then Luis can start help us with moderating all the other questions. Lachita, all yours.
Thanks, Prakash. And thanks, Sinan. I'm really happy that we have you here today. My name is Lachizar, and I'm a PhD candidate in marketing based in Germany. So I listened to your podcast appearance on the Prof G podcast. I'm a big fan of the dog, although I roasted him on my latest column. In this episode, you presented a very interesting idea related to one of the problems connected to social media, and namely it's the problem of its stickiness. And you vouched for structural reform that's related to data portability and interoperability. It's an idea that I have also presented in our group, and it will be really great if you can present it in more detail for us and elaborate on it. Thanks.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for your question. Great question. I wish you the best in your endeavors of the PhD marketing. As you know, I teach marketing at Sloan, so my PhD is not in marketing, but a lot of what I do is marketing, and so I got a joint appointment in marketing and in IS because of that. It's so much of an overlap. So yeah, Scott is a friend. I used to teach at the Stern School, and so I knew him as a colleague then, and he's a very smart guy in so many ways, and so I appreciated that conversation. He asked very good questions, and you guys should check out that episode of the Prof G show. It should be in his archived episodes. It was fairly recent, I think. In terms of interoperability and portability, let me put it this way. So one of the main concerns that we have is how do we bring competition to the social media economy? That's essential because that competition is what's going to provide the incentives for platforms to change. If they don't face competition, they don't have an incentive to change because they're just making profits. Why disturb what they're doing? When I say we need competition, the first thing that comes to people's minds is, oh, you mean break up Facebook? But I actually don't think that that is a long-term solution to competition in this economy. And the reason for that is because the social media economy runs on network effects. And network effects means that the value of a platform is a function of the number of users on that platform. And as a managerial economist, we know as economists that economies that run on network effects tend toward market concentration. They tend toward monopoly just because of the nature of the economics of the industry. Okay, and if you break up the market leader without dealing with those underlying economic forces, you'll just tip the next Facebook-like company into market dominance. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. So what you need is structural reforms of the economy itself. And what that means is interoperability and portability, social network portability. So interoperability is legislating that the platforms have to design technologies where you can communicate across the platforms. And a great example of that is in the US, where there was the AOL Time Warner merger. AOL had an instant messenger called AIM, and it was the market leader, had about 65% market share. And it was not interoperable with MSN Messenger or Yahoo Messenger. And that allowed it to use network effects to maintain it wasn't a monopoly per se, but its market leadership was maintained by network effects. As a result of the Time Warner merger guidelines, AOL was forced to make AIM interoperable with MSN and Yahoo Messenger. 1 year later, it went to 59% market share from 65%. Then it went to 55% a year after that, and then it ceded the entire market to new entrants. So interoperability can create a ton of competition in a market with network effects. There's actually a bill before Congress in the United States called the Access Act, which would force all social media platforms greater than 100 million users to become interoperable. So I think bills like that, that's the type of legislation we need to enact interoperability. When it comes to portability, I mean being able to take my social network with me if I want to switch from one provider to another. And currently you can't do that. You know, there are very rudimentary, like download my social network buttons, but those are not extensible or usable things that everybody knows that that's a sham, basically. And so in terms of portability, a good analogy is to number portability in the cell phone market. So it used to be that you couldn't take your cell phone number with you if you switched from like a Verizon to Sprint. But we legislated eventually that you had to, by law, allow a customer to keep their cell phone number if they switched from one carrier to another. And if you think back to that time, that cell phone number was your social network at the time, because that's where everyone knew to call you. And so research shows that number portability created a ton of consumer surplus through competition once it became law. In Europe, it created $880 million of consumer surplus every quarter for years and years and years when cell phone numbers were forced to be portable. So in the same way, I should be able to take my social network with me when I go from one provider to another. If I can switch easily from one provider to another and not lose my friends and ability to communicate with everyone, then the platforms start to have to compete for our business by designing better platforms, by making it so that their privacy policies are good, that their security is good, that they tamp down misinformation. Because I'm going to use the on-ramp to social media that is the cleanest, the best, the most secure, the most respecting of my privacy. And if one platform is better than another in that respect, I'll go there. Right now, I can't do that because there's no interoperability, and they've got all my data, they've got all my social networks, and I'll lose all of them if I leave. So those are the structural reforms that I'm talking about. And by the way, just one more note. People sometimes say, oh, is that technically feasible? I think that this is one of the easier things that the platforms could solve technically compared to the many harder things that they've done technically. And it would be easy to create a stack of a few types of standard messaging formats: textual, video, disappearing stories. They all have the same formats, right? LinkedIn has stories, Twitter has fleets, Instagram has stories, Facebook has stories now. They all have those. They all have textual posts, they all have video posts. Certain number of those, like the stack of 5 or 7, could be standard and have standards around them that everybody use the same standards. And then if the platforms want to build proprietary message types on top of that, then that might be a way to do it. But I don't think this is a technical challenge that's insurmountable either.
Thanks so much, Sinan. And there's been some great comments coming in on the chat, great sharing of links and books, and there's fantastic chat going on. A lot of observations as opposed to actual direct questions. And one observation from Kathleen, she's talking about the subject of homophily and, well, clustered. This is all addressed in chapter 3 in the Hype Machine: the smaller world, a few steps away, the hype loops. Maybe, Sinan, you'd just like to talk about how these two things, clustered, play such a big role in both the success and the spread of misinformation.
Yeah, you know, the two major algorithms that are common to all social media networks that are essential to understand are the friend suggestion algorithms, or the people you may know algorithms, which essentially guide the evolution of the structure of the human social network online, and then the feed algorithms, which are responsible for what you see in your feed, and this is true across every social media platform. The interesting thing about the friend suggestion algorithms is that they were faced with a difficult engineering challenge, which was, how do I recommend the next person Sinan should connect to out of the over 3 billion people on Facebook? And one engineering shortcut that makes that algorithm easier to run is just to say, well, let's limit our search to friends of Sinan, because that'll make smaller the set from which I'm going to select possible recommendations. Otherwise, it's totally inefficient for every one of the 3 billion users to search through 3 billion users to figure out who's going to be the best recommendation. So this was kind of like an engineering shortcut to make the algorithm more efficient. But what that does is it makes it more likely that you're going to be recommending to connect to people who are more like themselves. So it's going, exactly, the forbidden triad. So it's going to what sociologists call closed triangles in the human social network, much more than you would expect in the natural world. And that creates clustering and homophily. And what homophily means, as you probably all know, is birds of a feather flock together. So you're putting people into these clusters that are very homophilous, more than you would expect. It's much less diverse than it would be without the algorithm. And that creates polarization, or it contributes to polarization. And by the way, in chapter 10, I go through all the evidence for whether there's filter bubbles and polarization. There's been a lot of large-scale experimental studies on this. Almost none of them have yet been published because they're so new. There's only like 1 or 2 that have actually been published. And so that's the first part, is the friend suggestion algorithms creating clustering and homophily. That's like in Granovetter's terms, the forbidden triad. Triangles are closed when you recommend friends of friends. So I actually have obviously a lot of acquaintances and friends inside social media companies, and I was talking to one of them, and he was talking about their friend suggestion algorithm, and he basically said, yeah, the algorithm is just going around closing triangles all day long, and that was just such a stunning thing to hear, because it really does, it's shaping the structure of the human social network, and that's having dramatic consequences that we're seeing now. The other major algorithm is the feed algorithm, and that's what operates on what I call the hype loop. And actually all these algorithms operate on the hype loop, but essentially the hype loop is the interplay between human behavior, human agency, and machine intelligence. The machine analyzes us, thinks about what we're going to like most and what would engage us. Then it shows us that, and then we like some of those things. We click on some of them, we don't click on others. And that loop is a feedback loop where it makes suggestions, we make decisions, we feed those decisions back into the machine analyzes anew and makes more suggestions. That loop is how we get to the content that we see today. And a lot of that is going to favor those things that are hyping us up. That's why I call it the hype machine, because it runs on engagement.
Thanks so much, Sinan. And another observation, as opposed to really a question, came from Binit. Thank you, Binit. And he was referring to what you cover in chapter 4, the neurological cravings. You call it the mentalizing network. It's a recipe for a habit. So maybe you'd now talk a little bit about that craving back for more.
Yeah.
And social media is built for our brains.
Yeah. So yeah, this chapter is called Your Brain on Social Media, and it goes through all the neuroscience evidence of what happens inside our brains when we use social media. It's such a fascinating set of stories. A couple of things to point out there. One is that part of the reason we crave social media so much is that we experience neurological pain from being lonely. And that's because we're a social species. So we have evolved to be social because our neurological impulses make it hurt when we are alone or lonely. So we seek out connection, and we have come to dominate the planet because we're a social species. We're obviously the most complex social species on the planet. We have organizations of hundreds of thousands of people. We communicate over this crazy technology that we've invented. Incredibly social species. So that that first piece about the neurological implications of loneliness is why, in part, the hype machine took off so rapidly. And then the next piece that's important is the dopamine reward cycle, which essentially we get hits of dopamine when we see comments, shares, likes on our content, and that keeps us engaged. And so, and it was designed that way. So Sean Parker told Mike Allen, a reporter, in 2017, yeah, we basically designed it to give you little hits of dopamine so that you'd keep coming back. And so all of these neurological implications are really important to understand in terms of how social media hooks us neurologically. And I also, in that chapter, talk about how those neurological impulses actually shape our behavior in the physical world and in the online world, how it actually changes the way we behave. It's not just, oh, we get dopamine hits. It then feeds back into how we're going to behave in the future. And one thing one last thing I'll note about the neuroscience, which I found fascinating, is that it is wired for both the promise and the peril of social media. And so, for instance, we find when we do the neuroscience studies that so there was a study done at UCLA that showed pictures of Instagram style photos that were depicting risky behaviors, and they randomized the number of likes that somebody saw associated with a given picture that was risky, like taking drugs and alcohol or doing something like that. And what they found was that people were much more likely to engage in that risky behavior if they were shown the photos that randomly were assigned to have more likes. And so what it does is, and they showed this through brain scans, was that it turns off or turns down the response inhibition network in our kids' brains when pictures of risky behaviors have more randomly assigned likes on them, which is just mind-blowing, in that, oh, this means that my brain is has less response inhibition. I'm much less inhibited if I see that other people are liking this risky behavior. But if there are other studies that show that the more likes on altruistic behaviors encourage people to give more to charity. So this type of neurological response can be used to condition and encourage positive behaviors as well as risky behaviors. And that's part and parcel of the promise and the peril.
Thanks so much, Sinan. You can tell from everything that Sinan's sharing with us today. It's an absolutely fascinating book. It's as good as the best thriller that you'll read. Some of the stories that he shares. Priyanka, I'm not quite sure what your question is, but you've said to me that you've something that you would like to ask Sinan. So if you'd like to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Sorry, it was a little long, so I didn't type it out. Hi, Sinan. So my question is basically, I'm currently enrolled in the MA Social and at SOAS, and I'm also an experimental psychologist. And I took a course on global digital cultures in Term 1. And throughout the course, obviously, we discussed everything that was in your book and what you've been talking about today. And the one question that came out, that there are two narratives when it comes to technology and social media. One is that it's incredibly positive, it can improve lives, it's connecting people, the information society in the digital sphere. The second is the whole thing about deep fake surveillance and stuff. So the question was, is technology liberating and creating a free society through common-based peers, or is it actually doing the exact opposite and taking away our freedom? And it's sort of philosophical, but yeah, that's the thing. Which narrative is actually happening?
So the answer is yes. It's doing both, and it is equipped to do both, and how we handle it going forward is going to determine if we get more of the freedom or more of the conditioning. And I think that there is a large, it is important to note that the algorithms can affect our beliefs, our behaviors, our perceptions. And so in that sense, it both, as I describe in the book, it both enables and constrains our freedom. How we use it and how it's designed and sort of the solutions we pursue in response to a number of the difficulties that I describe in the book are going to determine how much more we get the promise or the peril, the freedom or the constraint.
Thanks so much, Sinan. Mariah, I think you have a question. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Louise, so much. It's just such a wonderful time to listen to Professor Sinan here. So I have a very high IQ. Early on in my life, I recognized that I have ADD. And so I have learned to compensate for that by using the kinesthetic sense. So I have to write things down because I have a superb visual memory. I memorize pages and pages, words, where it is situated on a page. So when you talked about social media introduction into children in elementary or early on in their school development, I kind of had this question, well, what do we do with kids that have learning disabilities, like myself or others that maybe have no auditory memory, or maybe the visual is just not there? How do we help those kids to develop their full potential by using social media and all the things you talked about that you said, let's just bring it early on into schools?
Yeah. So I don't advocate for bringing it early on into schools. What I advocate for is bringing awareness and literacy education into schools so that people can know how to distinguish truth from falsity. People can know to think critically. Kids can know to think critically about what they hear on social media if they are using it. I'll preface this by saying, some of you may or may not know this, that Steve Jobs didn't allow his kids to use the iPad. The guy who invented it and was the chief evangelist for the technology is not allowing his kids to use the iPad. And my son is 7, and he gets almost no technology at all. And it's harder now because he's in virtual school. I joke by saying that he never got any screens before the pandemic, and now he can fix my laptop. Like in such a short period of time.
So going back to the same question, kind of a sub question, what is an ideal age in a child's development? For example, I did not allow my oldest son, who's turning 20, to watch anything on TV. There was no TV, never mind computers back then, nothing at all, up until he was 4 years of age. It was all Lego, it was all go do something else. Play with the dog, I don't care. But what is in your opinion, the age where we can turn this thing on?
I'll tell you. So I just wanted to answer the question you also had about kids that have developmental, issues. I am not an expert in that. So I don't want to overstep my expertise. I don't have any expertise in child development or in that. But what I will say is that the technology is what we make it. So if people with expertise in that were able to design apps or add-ons that would be appropriate, I think it could actually be used to address some of those difficulties. Now, in terms, but again, I'm not an expert, and I will say, in terms of like what age is appropriate, this is a very personal decision. But my personal decision, like you, is that I give my son almost no technology, TV, pad, phone, or otherwise. I just try to resist the flow, the tide of it at every turn. And I know I'm going to lose that battle. But if I just say no all the time, he'll probably end up getting an appropriate amount with the overflow that I can't stop, you know? So we'll watch TV once a week for like half an hour together. We like to watch Chef's Table on Netflix because he likes to cook. But you know, so he doesn't do the pad, he doesn't do the phone, he doesn't do TV, but he's on his computer all day during school because he has to be on the Zoom calls with his class. So.
Right. Well, he's going to be a brilliant chef.
We'll see.
Thanks, Mariah. Thanks, Sinan. See, we didn't know we were going to be getting child rearing advice from the professor today as well, so fantastic. Now, also, there's a big presence within the book of, I don't quite know how to, basically Russia. And Kathleen, more specific than just talk about the country in general, Kathleen has a question. Do you want to go ahead with your question, Kathleen, about Telegram and public?
Sure.
Thanks, Kathleen. Kathleen's camera not
sorry,
working.
my camera
right.
today.
That's okay. Go ahead, Kathleen.
It's very frustrating. Okay, so until last week's insurrection, I had not heard of Telegram. And I'm reading your book, and you have this whole thing on Pavel Durov, and then bringing up Telegram, and I was like, what? So kind of freaked me out. And I was just wondering, since he is such a libertarian, is he going to do anything about trying to limit the terrorist use of his platform?
You know, I think he's going to resist at every turn. By the way, for those of you who haven't read the book, that was such a fascinating story to research, because it really is, like, that guy is a fascinating guy. And the story of how Telegram was built and how he basically had to, like, take his team and elude the Russian government and go from hotel to hotel and, you know, be clandestine in the development, and how he had to, like, get a passport from a Caribbean nation to be able to travel, you know, and he had to donate, you know, to their sugar industry to become a citizen so that he could avoid the Russian government. And people call him the Neo of Russia, like referring to the Matrix movies, because he wears all black trench coats. It's just like this surreal story that I couldn't believe I was finding when I was researching, you know, the sort of history of every platform, and that's a particularly fascinating story. To answer your question, he is a staunch libertarian. He believes that the government is a much bigger threat than terrorists using his platform. You know, Telegram is encrypted except for the groups. And so my guess is that he is going to resist government requests for information as much as he absolutely possibly can. And he has designed his entire operation to resist government intrusion. And what I mean by that is, you know, he's located servers in places where it's difficult to get government oversight. He has, you know, he's not physically located in any one place. He's incorporated in places that are harder to get you know, government oversight of. He's constantly traveling. Nobody knows where he is, etc. It's just I think that he will resist at all as much as he possibly can.
Doesn't bode well for the prevention of terrorist strikes.
Yeah, you know, he would say essentially, I agree with you, and as I say in the book, but I think he would say that, you know, the instances of the one or two cases around the world every couple of years where Telegram is used for a nefarious purpose are far outweighed by the daily you know, erosion of our rights in the government, you know, knowing everything about us. That's sort of how he would describe it, I think.
Okay.
Great question, Kathleen. Thanks so much. Yeah, that's a great part of the book. Now, Devika, you have a question for the professor about transparency paradox. If you'd like to go ahead.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Louise. Hi, Professor. It's great to have you here today. So my question actually is about the transparency paradox that you mentioned on one of your TED Talks. And I just wonder that when you're trying to balance a social media network being open about the way the algorithm works with how secure they need to be with our data, I mean, how do we still keep the social network incentivized to innovate if they have to pretty much open their book?
Yeah, so I think that there are ways to research how things are working without revealing every little detail. Many times when scientists do research, they will report what's necessary to the science, but they will maintain trade secrets of the company that they have come to learn during the course of their research. When I work with one of these platforms, we typically sign a research agreement and a data use agreement, and a lot of that is covered in a way that we can do the research to make the things that we need to make transparent, but to sort of, hide some of the stuff that's less relevant to the research, but are trade secrets. But the transparency paradox is a really important concept going forward, I think. And just for those of you who haven't read the book or haven't seen one of these TED Talks, the book also talks about the transparency paradox. The idea here is that we are simultaneously asking the platforms to be more open and transparent about how they work under the hood, but also more secure and private, right? And so if you remember, the Cambridge Analytica scandal started with Facebook sharing data with a researcher at Cambridge University, who then shared the data with Cambridge Analytica, right? And so that is a perfect example of the transparency paradox. Of course, we want more scientific access and other types of oversight access to figure out how it's working under the hood so we can have a meaningful conversation in society to discuss how we steer this towards the promise and away from the peril. We need to know how the algorithms work. We need to know, why we're seeing polarization or filter bubbles, or if we are, and what's the cause of that. But at the same time, we don't want, we want security and we want privacy. And so we have to figure out ways to thread the needle of the transparency paradox in order to achieve more transparency and more security at the same time. And that is a very difficult thing to do, but we have some solutions. A good example is what's known as differential privacy, which essentially is a standard by which you can obfuscate data so that you can't, so that you can give the data to a researcher, but that they can't recreate the underlying links to individuals in that data. You can give individual level data without actually compromising the security or privacy of the individuals. And so differential privacy was used by Facebook in order to mask a very large swath of data that they gave to Social Science One eventually. And Social Science One is an industry academic consortium that is designed to be able to get access to data to make these platforms more transparent through science. And differential privacy is how they were able to thread the needle of the requirements for security and privacy on one hand, and the need to be more open and share data with the scientific community on the other hand.
Thanks so much. Great question, Devika. Thank you. And if you're not all worried enough already by everything that we've talked about today, it's all been absolutely fascinating. I'd just like to ask another personal question before I hand back to Prakash to wrap up. And Sinan, I'd like you to maybe just quickly talk to the members a little bit more about your section in talking about brain-computer interface. I'm just going to read a little line from the book. As Regina Duggan, head of Facebook's brain-computer skunkwork, described it, it's not about decoding random thoughts. We're talking about decoding the words you've already decided to share by sending them to the speech center of your brain. And as Sinan comments, well, that's comforting For a second there, I thought I should be worried. Can we just really, I know there's so much in there, but it's just a really scary section. So could you just tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, most of the major platforms are pursuing this, and they're making a lot of progress. Elon Musk has talked about this at length in public. The idea is essentially creating a set of sensors that can read your brain. And the point of it would be to essentially, you know, make more efficient the process of communicating with the computer. So you don't have to go through the added hassle of typing it out. We'll just plug right into your brain and we'll read your thoughts. And that is the real deal thing that they are doing. And they have had a skunkworks at Facebook, and they have gotten the technology from the size of like a room full of computers to the size of a small refrigerator. And you know, eventually it's going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until it is something that can be, you know, deployed on a mobile device or something that's always with you. You know, there's a lot of questions about how they might interface with your brain, you know, to you know, how what's the right interface and so on. But, you know, this is a bit of a forward-looking part of the book, but it's something to just kind of flag for readers to say, hey, you know, this is how the technology is evolving. You know, we talk about video and visual cortex and the rise of deepfakes. We also need to, you know, talk about the fact that they're working pretty extensively on a brain-computer interface in multiple different companies.
Thanks. Yeah, I can see the concern spreading across. Harmony and Jing are both sitting there just like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? Thank you so much, Sinan. It's been an absolutely absorbing conversation with you. Fantastic speaker. Everything you said, so interesting. I can't recommend this book enough. It's fantastic. My husband's been teasing me because he says, what is the point of underlining something if you're going to underline every single line in the whole book? So that's the state of my book. It's just wrecked already. But thank you, Sinan. Thank you, all of our members, for joining us. I'm going to hand back to Prakash to wrap up the event. I thank you all for joining us today for a really fascinating conversation. Thanks, Prakash.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, everyone, for all those fantastic questions. The book, The Hype Machine, is available on Amazon, on Flipkart, and almost any platform you can buy books on, both physical and digital copy, from what I understand. And please get your hands on it. It's been one of the best books that we read recently, and God knows we have read a lot of books, right? It's a fantastic book. It starts right with tanks rolling down in Crimea. That is a part of Ukraine. And from that, it starts building up about this fascinating story of what's happening. We're talking algorithms, we're talking elections, we're talking conspiracy theories. We're talking about, you know, monopoly laws and all the jazz. And in between, we are talking some more scarier stuff. And then there is a fantastic part, a tiny line. I think I would like to end on that. It's towards later chapters where Sinan is talking about how communities can self-moderate, and it's around Reddit banning certain subreddits, and they keep on doing that. They've in fact done one recently. And what researchers found was when you ban this or when you self-regulate, right, the virus or the infection stops there. It doesn't spread. So I guess that is kind of telling us that it is not people are evil or people have become bad or, you know, is brainwashed too deep beyond the point. It just means we are like kids, I guess we're like children, and you have given us a toy which you don't know how to use. So it's you got to find a way to moderate the toy. Fantastic book, Sinan. Thank you so much for being a part of this discussion here with us. Thank you for wearing the mask. Sinan is the first guest of ours, by the way, folks, who was outside. He's not in his home right now, he's outside right now, hence he's wearing a mask. So thank you so much, and
I really appreciate the invitation and the conversation. Thank you to all of you for the fantastic questions. If you do read the book and you like it, please do rate it on Amazon. I would really appreciate that. As I've learned through this research, the algorithms do matter a tremendous amount, so that really helps. And just help spread the word. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors. I think that these concepts are really important to so much of our future society, because social media is such an important part of our information ecosystem now.
Thank you so much, Sinan. Thanks, Prakash. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Same time next week. And yeah, we just look forward to seeing you again. We thank you for continually turning up, supporting us, and putting such fantastic questions to our guests. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you at the same time next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, Kat, Jing, Lashazar. Thanks, Nola. Maria, thanks, lovely question. Thanks, Davika. Thank you, everybody.